Happy Monday, everyone, and welcome back. Welcome back to this podcast series, and I'm super excited because this week's topic is we're going to talk about something that is super important if you want to live a courageous, happy, and successful life, and that is vulnerability. We're going to talk about how to become more vulnerable in an authentic way, why that matters, and how it makes a difference in your life. We're going to be talking about this all week, but today I'm going to talk about, as a child, how I learned to be vulnerable and how I carry those lessons with me in adulthood and why that matters. So here we go. Welcome back to the Aha Moments. I'm Elliott Connie, and here's where I share the lessons I've learned in my work as a psychotherapist and in my life to help you to live your very best life. And to talk to you about vulnerability, I want to talk to you about an opportunity lost. So first of all, let's define vulnerability. And vulnerability is when you expose yourself and make yourself available to harm or attack, right? It's when you tell your truth and you say something out loud, you make something clear that could become hurtful to you. And I don't know that everybody is born with the ability to be vulnerable. I think it's something that we have to learn. But I'm going to tell you kind of an embarrassing story about an opportunity that I lost and how that impacts me even to this very, very day. Now, a lot of people don't believe this about me, like the people who know me, even people who are very, very close to me don't believe me when I tell them that I'm an introvert. Some people have referred to me as a charismatic introvert because I do. I like to have time to myself and I like to do introverted things. And as a child, I was really, really shy. Now, my freshman year in high school, I had a huge crush on this girl named Michelle. We were friends and she was beautiful. Michelle was like, and I was 13 years old at the time, but I just had this huge crush on Michelle. And I couldn't work up the nerve to talk to her. Why? Because remember, being vulnerable means you're exposing yourself to being hurt or attacked. Sometimes physically, sometimes emotionally, but whatever. So in order to tell Michelle that I have a crush on her, I have to expose myself to being rejected, being put down. In high school, being embarrassed. Like, can you imagine being in high school and you let people know that you have a crush on Michelle and Michelle says, no, I don't want to give you my phone number, or no, I don't want to talk to you, or whatever. It's embarrassing and it's hurtful and it's hard. And I just couldn't work up the nerve. Now, we were friends. We sat next to each other in one of our classes and occasionally I'd walk to class with whatever, but I really, one of my first, authentic, I really, really have a crush on you kind of crushes. And then years go by and Michelle and I stayed close friends. We stayed friends all through high school. Years go by, and then my junior year, Michelle's got a boyfriend who was also one of my friends, by the way. And one day, her and her boyfriend had an argument, and I was sitting in the cafeteria talking to Michelle, and Michelle said, I had a crush on you all freshman year. You're such a nice guy. I wish you would. Her boyfriend's name was Nick. I wish you would talk to Nick and teach him how to be a nice guy. And I was like, what? I had no clue that she had a crush on me all freshman year. I remember in that moment feeling like this tremendous sense of loss. Like, if I had just been courageous enough to say something, how that would have changed my high school experience and all those things. And I remember making a promise right then and there. I'm never, ever going to miss out an opportunity because of my inability to be vulnerable. And if you think about it, like here in my career now, vulnerability is a huge part of what I do. Because I submit book proposals to publishers and I make myself available to being rejected. I submit projects to all kinds of different entities and make myself vulnerable to being rejected. I put out videos into the world and make myself vulnerable that people might not like the videos that I make, or people might even criticize or say harmful or hurtful things. But if I don't do that, then I'm not living my authentic truth. And then the positive things that come from that aren't available. So you have to be able to make yourself vulnerable to the difficult things so that you can experience the positive things. Now, today I shared with you a missed opportunity. I truly, and I'm 45 years old now. That happened when I was 32 years ago. And Michelle and I are still friends. We're Facebook friends. I mean, we don't live in the same place anymore. I grew up in Massachusetts, and that's where that happened. But I still use that as a lesson to motivate me. Like, if I don't put myself in line to experience potential hurt, then I'm also removing my ability to experience tremendous triumph. And that's really, really important. So I want to challenge you. I want you to go out there and think about what are opportunities that you could take to be vulnerable, and what would be the triumph. I want you to think about what could be the triumph that could happen if you availed yourself to the opportunity to be hurt. What would be the triumph if it worked out and everything went well? Hey, thanks so much for being here today. If you wouldn't mind, do me a huge favor and share this podcast on your social media platforms, or with at least one person that you think could benefit from hearing this message today. And don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to your podcast. And I can't wait to see you tomorrow. Today I want to talk about an aspect of vulnerability that I've been wanting to talk about for a really, really long time. And that is, why is being vulnerable seen as such a negative trait in our society? Like, what makes us afraid to be vulnerable? What makes us afraid to struggle to share ourselves and to step out and expose our authentic selves? And why it matters that we overcome that fear. That's what I'm going to be talking about today. I want to welcome you back to the aha moments, where every day I share the lessons I've learned in my work as a psychotherapist and in my life to inspire you to live your very best life. So let's talk about being vulnerable for a second. And especially just because I am a male, I want to talk a little bit about it from the male perspective. Is I think that we associate being vulnerable and sharing your emotions and feelings with being weak. And I find that odd, because like the strongest thing you could do is be vulnerable and be authentic. Like literally the thing that requires the most strength is to share your authentic experiences, to share your authentic emotions, to make yourself available to being hurt and harmed when it is your truth. That is literally the strongest thing that you could possibly do. But in our society, we view that as a weakness. In our society, we view that as a characteristic associated with being weak. And I truly don't understand that. I don't understand that at all. You know, when I was in high school, I had a friend. His name was Brandon. And I often think about being vulnerable, and I often think about my friend Brandon, because Brandon had a girlfriend. Brandon had like a super huge crush on this girl. He was a popular kid. He was on the basketball team with me and a couple other sports teams, and he was just a popular kid, and he had a crush on this girl forever. I mean, it was kind of like, Brandon, let it go, man. Like, she's not going to date you. Let it go. And Brandon eventually, like, holy cow, she became his girlfriend against all odds. And, you know, somehow it happened. And Brandon is dating, you know, this girl, this popular girl. And they broke up. And Brandon was just wrecked. I mean, he was really, really sad. But I remember watching Brandon, like, pretend to be okay. And I remember telling Brandon, like, man, if you're hurting, if you're struggling, it's okay. Like, Brandon, if you're hurting, if you're having a hard time, like, it is totally fine. But he worked really hard to be like the macho guy that wasn't hurt that this girl had broken up with him. And a little while later, Brandon stopped coming to school, and his mom told us that she had to hospitalize him. And I didn't know why. I didn't know why Brandon's mom, or what Brandon's mom had noticed about him that told her, like, this is serious enough that he needed to be removed from school and to be hospitalized and evaluated and all those things. And then Brandon got out of the hospital and he came back to school, and we were so happy to see him. And then after a couple of weeks, he ended his life. Brandon committed suicide. And, you know, at the time, I didn't understand what had happened, and I was shocked by what happened, and I was hurt by what happened. I mean, it was one of the first losses I experienced in my life. And now, you know, I've grown up and I've become a psychotherapist, and I think back about that time often. And when I think about vulnerability, I think back about Brandon. I think, what was he dealing with internally, and what role did society's pressure for him to, like, be strong? Well, really what we're saying is be quiet or be silent. But how would Brandon have experienced it if he were free to let those emotions out? Like, how would Brandon have felt if he lived in a society where it was acceptable for him to hurt and share his hurts and to share his emotions and to express himself? I watched him work really hard, and I knew he was hurting. I knew him really well. We'd known each other for a real long time. So I knew he was hurting. I knew he was struggling, but I watched him work really, really hard to pretend to be okay. And I can't help but think that somehow played a role in what ultimately happened. And I think about that, and I just think we need to be bold as people. Like, I need to share my experiences, whether you like it or not, and whether it makes you comfortable or not. I need to be my authentic, vulnerable self. But I also think as society, we have to work hard to create an environment where people can be vulnerable and share their experiences and go through hard things in an authentic way. Because I think to not is not only not healthy, but it's also unsafe. People can end up being harmed. So I want you guys to think about what you could do to help this be a society where it is safe to express our vulnerable emotions and experiences, and how you could make people feel safe in that way. And also how you could be bold when you're going through something hard and difficult and make yourself vulnerable as well. I think both things are important. Hey, thanks for being here today. Please do me a huge favor and share this podcast on your social media platforms, or with at least one person that you think would benefit from hearing this message today. And don't forget to subscribe to this podcast on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, Anchor, or wherever you listen to your podcast. And I will see you tomorrow. What's up, everyone? And welcome back. We're going to talk about vulnerability and continue our discussion about vulnerability. And today we're going to talk about vulnerability as it relates to social media. Now, I have a lot to say about this as a mental health professional. I have a lot to say about this as a social media influencer. I have a lot to say about this as someone who professionally engages in social media conversations and publishes a lot of content on social media. And I'm excited to get into this today because I think this is an important topic that I think a lot of us need to address, and a lot of us need to have our mind wrapped around. So I'm super excited to talk about this today. So I want to welcome you back to the aha moments, where every day I share the lessons I've learned in my work as a psychotherapist and in my life to inspire you to live your very best life. So one of the reasons why I think social media is so important, or actually there are two main reasons I think social media or having conversations and understanding around social media is so important. The first one is because we all have social media pages. Like, we're all on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and Snapchat and TikTok and all of the platforms. Like almost everybody is on one of, if not all, of these platforms. And number two, we typically engage in these platforms at a young age. Like, we typically start getting on these platforms in our early teenage years, before our social psyche and before our mental health is fully developed. And I think it's important to understand the impact of being vulnerable on social media. And it's something that I deal with every single day. Like, if you look at my social media platforms, like, there are people that say things about me that are just horrible and awful. And there are comments that happen on these pages that are just absolutely horrible and just absolutely awful. And I share a lot of my life because of the job that I have, because of the work that I do. And it's kind of a catch-22, because social media is part of how I've gotten into the position that I've been in, but it's also responsible for some of the difficult mental health moments as well. Because I don't care who you are, like, it's hard to expose that much of yourself on social media and experience that much hate in return. And I've had people say some of the most awful things that you can imagine, and it is unpleasant. Like, it doesn't matter to me who you are. It doesn't matter to me how successful you are. It doesn't matter to me how many degrees you have and none of that stuff. It's just hard. So why do we do it? Because I think that we have to be able to be our authentic selves in all places and spaces, and understand that will sometimes come along with consequences, and that will sometimes come along with difficulties. I think where we get ourselves into trouble is when we start censoring ourselves and editing who we are in not being our best self, our most authentic self. I think that includes social media, but I also think it includes real life. I think it includes our personal interactions. Like, we've got to have and develop the ability to be our authentic selves. And I think that's what saves me, is like, I can be okay with whatever consequences come from me being my true self, whether it's something I post on social media or something I engage in my real life. But when I am out in the world being me in the digital space, it's okay, because for me, that's the goal. I don't post content for likes. I don't post content for anybody's approval. I post content because it's my authentic self coming from an authentic place, wanting to make an authentic difference in this world. And whatever the consequences from doing that, be they good, be they bad, be they whatever, I can live with those consequences, and I can live with those consequences quite well. But I think we have to have conversations with people starting at a young age, because we get on these platforms at a young age. And I think we have to have conversations with people at a young age about the importance of being yourself and taking chances. And that's what vulnerability is all about, right? I've said this multiple times this week as we've covered this topic. It's about being your authentic self and taking chances that expose you to potential failure, hurt feelings, difficulties. And when you have the ability to be your authentic self and take that risk and take that chance, you are more likely to actually feel good about yourself on the other side of it. And you're more likely to have an experience of success on the other side of it. And that includes social media as well. Like, there are lots of social media people that have posted content and it led to huge success. Like, there was a singer whose name I'm forgetting, of course, but she was discovered on MySpace, and lots of people have gone on to do amazing things on social media, but it's because they've learned to just be their authentic selves and then deal with the consequences of it. And I think that's the goal here. Don't post on social media because you want people to like your content or engage in your content or trying to go viral or any of that stuff. You got to post and be your authentic self and take the risk and take the chance. And I'm sure you're going to upset people and bother people, and they're going to say things about you that aren't enjoyable, but you're also going to put yourself in line to having some pretty big success as well. And that's what I want for each and every one of you. So I want to ask you, have you ever been vulnerable on social media? Have you ever been vulnerable from something you posted on social media? Have you ever felt exposed? What is the benefit that can come from that? And what's the benefit of being your authentic self and being vulnerable on social media? And how can it make a difference in your life? Thank you so much for being here today. Please do me a huge favor and share this podcast on your social media platforms, or with at least one person that you think could benefit from hearing this message today. And don't forget to subscribe to this podcast. You can do that on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Anchor, anywhere you listen to your podcast. And I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Earlier in the week, I talked about my childhood experiences with being vulnerable and how those lessons from my childhood, I still carry them with me to this day and how they make a difference in my life. But today I want to talk to you about being vulnerable in my adulthood and how showing up, being authentic and vulnerable and doing things that are sometimes hard and sometimes make me uncomfortable have made a huge, and I mean huge, difference in my life. I want to welcome you back to the aha moments, where every day I share the lessons I've learned in my work as a psychotherapist and in my life to inspire you to live your very best life. And like I said, today we're going to talk about me being vulnerable and doing things that require me to be vulnerable in my adulthood. And when I think about being vulnerable in my adulthood, I want to talk to you about kind of my work in the professional world. Because doing solution-focused brief therapy, that's the type of therapy that I do in the field of psychotherapy, has required me to be really, really vulnerable. And again, just to rehash it, the definition of being vulnerable is when you make yourself available to being judged, criticized, or even hurt, and hurt emotionally or physically. And I want to start in the early part of my career, when I really started working and loving this kind of therapy and doing therapy in this way. I was studying a bunch of books, and I noticed that a lot of the books weren't really resonating with me and weren't really the kind of books that I thought were optimizing the reader's training. And my first vulnerable thing was kind of like owning that I was having that thought and having a desire to write a book. And I remember talking to one of my mentors about that. Like, I really have this book I want to write. And I was totally expecting her to judge me and criticize me. But she supported me and she kind of guided me on how to write something known as a book proposal. And a book proposal is you put together a document that you then send to a publisher, and then the publisher decides whether or not to publish your book. And I remember like putting together this document, and it took me several weeks to do it. And I sent it off to a publisher, and a friend of mine said, get ready to hear no. And they told me like the book Chicken Soup for the Soul got turned down 71 times before somebody said yes. And I thought, man, I don't know if I'm ready to hear no 70 something times. But ultimately, I think it was the second or third publisher I sent the proposal to said yes. And I remember thinking how glad I was that I had made myself vulnerable to share my ideas and to share my thoughts. And I've subsequently gone on to write 4 books. And each time you share your thoughts, each time you share your heart, each time you share what kind of work you do, you make yourself available to criticism and hurt feelings, because the way I do therapy is so sensitive to me. But that wasn't the only type of vulnerability that happened in my field. Like, I remember there was an organization that was doing some really, really difficult things to exclude me from being able to join the community. And there were people with much less credentials and with much fewer accomplishments than me that they had welcomed with open arms. And for me, for years, no matter what I did, they would never really open their doors to me. And probably the most vulnerable thing I ever did was me, along with my friend Adam Frower, who I've talked about many times on this podcast. We sent them an email asking them why they have such prejudice principles and why they do the things that they do. And I remember right before we hit send on that email, Adam turned to me and he said, "Are you ready?" Because we knew when you expose yourself in this way, it's going to lead to uncomfortable conversations, uncomfortable interactions, and uncomfortable experiences that were sure to come. And in the subsequent years, they did come. Those uncomfortable interactions and conversations and accusations, they most certainly did come. But I'm so proud of the fact that I stood up in a very vulnerable way and exposed what my experiences were and exposed what my thoughts were about those experiences. And on the other side of that, Adam and I are now the leaders of this field. And I now am the vice president on the board of that same exact organization. And I think about that and many other things that I don't really have time to go into here, but I think about like my ability and decision to be vulnerable as an adult has opened the door to significant successes in my life. Like, if I were too nervous to put my ideas out into the world, I wouldn't be one of the most hired lecturers in my field, and I wouldn't have the books that I have, and I wouldn't have the lecture history that I have. Like, you literally have to be willing to make yourself vulnerable if you want to experience the highest levels of triumph. And I'm really, really pleased that I was bold enough to be vulnerable, because on the other side of that was the kind of success that I could only have imagined. So that's what I want to share with you guys today. Like, being vulnerable makes you available to being successful. And without certain levels of vulnerability, you just can't be successful. So after me sharing what it was like for me to use vulnerability in my childhood and adulthood, I want you to think about what lessons you've learned hearing about vulnerability and watching other people be vulnerable. Thank you so much for being here today. If you wouldn't mind, please do me a huge favor. I'd love it if you would share this podcast on your social media platforms, or with at least one person that you think could benefit from hearing this message today. And don't forget to subscribe to this podcast. You can do that on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Anchor, wherever you listen to your podcast. And I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. So all week long, we have been talking about the importance of being vulnerable and taking risks and making yourself available to criticism and sometimes hurt feelings or even pain. But I want to wrap up this week by talking about when you watch other people be vulnerable and take a risk in that way, and how that can inspire you. So I want to welcome you back to the aha moments, where every day I share the lessons I've learned in my work as a psychotherapist and in my life to inspire you to live your very best life. So I want to talk about watching people take risks and become the best version of themselves. And the person that I think about in this way is a comedian named Dave Chappelle. Now, there are a lot of people who refer to Dave Chappelle as the greatest comic that has ever lived. Literally, he is so good at his comedic talent that one time he got up on stage and he said, "I'm so good at telling jokes. I can make you laugh telling joke backwards." And he told this joke. But what I admire so much about Dave Chappelle and how he has inspired me is I can remember hearing him in the early part of his career. He talked about how he got started as a comedian. Now, Dave Chappelle was a teenager, 14 years old, and he used to go to this restaurant. And after the restaurant was done serving food, they would turn into like an after hours club, and they would like move the tables out of the way and then turn into a dance club. But in between time, while they were just moving the tables, they would allow local comedians to come up on stage and entertain the crowd while that transition was happening. And Dave Chappelle talked about his biggest fear in life was bombing. And in the comedic world, bombing is when you tell a bunch of jokes and no one laughs, or in fact, they criticize you and they heckle you from the crowd and they do all these things. And Dave Chappelle said back then, like, his biggest fear was bombing. So one night he went up on stage and he told all his best jokes as the little teenage Dave Chappelle comic that he was, and he bombed. No one laughed. They were heckling him. They were giving him a hard time. And he walked backstage after he was done and realized, I did it. Like, I did the thing that I'm most afraid of. I did the thing that terrifies me. Like, I did the thing that I didn't think I'd be able to do. I bombed, and I'm still alive. Like, I'm still here. I made it through. And he talked about that moment being the best thing that ever happened to him, because once he went through the thing that he feared most, it removed his fear going forward. And he became like a fearless comic. And if you watch Dave Chappelle specials, comedy shows, he talks about subject matter and topics that no other person in that space would touch. And he does so in a unique way that only he would do it. And it comes from the fact that he made himself so vulnerable at 14 to do the thing that he was absolutely afraid to do, and he failed. But he made it through. He survived that failure, and it removed his fear. And I think about that, and I think, like, as a professional in this field and as a leader in the industry in which I am in, I want to be that fearful too. Like, I want to be as fearful as Dave Chappelle, and I want to talk about subjects and topics that most people would be afraid to touch. I want to talk about subject matter and topics because I don't want to be held back by fear. I don't want to be held back by the things that hold other people back. I want to be my very best self and share authentically no matter what the circumstances are. And that lesson, like watching that interview, I mean, it was probably 20 years ago, but watching that interview stuck with me because fearlessness is such a freeing idea, such a powerful notion. And the only way to become that fear is you first must make yourself vulnerable and allow yourself to be exposed and go through whatever it is that happens, be it good or be it bad, but be able to go through whatever it is you're about to experience. Because when you come out on the other side, you realize that you made it. Like, you can do anything, including experience pain. And that's one of the keyest lessons that I think I've ever learned in this space and in this world, and I hope it made a difference for you. So after listening to this podcast for a week of sharing about vulnerability and the importance of vulnerability, I just want you to think for a bit about, like, what are you going to take away from this experience? Like, what are you going to take away that has inspired you or you've learned about being vulnerable and why it matters? Hey, thanks for being here today. If you wouldn't mind, please do me a super huge favor and share this podcast on your social media platforms or with at least one person that you think could benefit from hearing this message today. And don't forget to subscribe to this podcast. You can do that on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, Anchor, wherever it is you enjoy listening to your podcast. And I can't wait to see you on Monday.